Okay, merci. Hello, everybody. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about the situation of Kurds in Iran. I would like also to thank Dr. Fernand de Varennes, as well as the organizer of this event. Indeed, Iran is composed of different ethnic groups. According to the Iranian authorities, the non-Persian ethnic minorities make up around 60% of the Iranian population. The main minority groups are Kurds, Turkish-speaking Azerbaijanis, Arabs, Baluchs, Lurs, and a smaller population of Armenian and Turkmen. Since the Pahlavi monarchy's creation of the modern Iranian nation state in 1905, the rulers in Tehran have imposed a brutal chauvinistic system based on the supremacy of Persian ethnicity and of the Shiite faith. Non-Persian peoples are treated as second-class citizens, denied the rights to public education in their own language. Forced Farsi language education is one major tool used by the Iranian regime to forcibly assimilate its non-Persian minorities. According to the Amnesty International, the Kurdish population in Iran is estimated at about 12 million. The discrimination against Kurds who are ethnically and religiously distant from Persian Shiite is constitutionally established. According to the Article 115 of the Iranian Constitution, one of the qualifications of candidate for the presidential is he has convinced belief in the fundamental principles of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the official mazhab of the country. So most of the Kurds, because of their religion, who are not Shiite, who are Sunnite, cannot be candidate for the presidency in Iran. This is the case in other high-ranking governmental posts. As far as I know, no Sunnite Kurd has held a ministerial or high governmental post since 4 decades of the Republic Islamic of Iran. The oppression against the Kurds began just after the revolution. The Kurds actively participated in the revolution of 1979. After that, the Kurdish political movement proposed a solution to the central government to solve the Kurdish question within a democratic Iran where the Kurds can enjoy in a regional autonomy. The Kurds did their best to find a peaceful solution. The central government refused the Kurdish demands. As soon as the central government felt strong enough, Ayatollah Khomeini, the religious leader of Iran, declared holy war against the Kurdish people. Since more than 10,000 Kurds have lost their lives. This violence continues till today. According to the UN Special Rapporteur on Iran, Kurdish political prisoners charged with national security offenses constitute a disproportionately high number of those who received the death penalty and are executed. Only in 2020, over 500 Iranian Kurds, including human rights defenders, were arrested for politically motivated reasons and charged with broad and vaguely worded national security-related offenses. At least 159 of them were subsequently sentenced to prison terms ranging from 1 month to 17 years of and 4 of them received the death penalty. Politically, the main Kurdish political parties in Iranian Kurdistan seeking an internal self-determination in form of federal system. Since the 4 decades of the reign of Republic of Islamic of Iran, all peaceful attempts proposed by the Kurdish representatives in Iran has met with violence and oppression. The Kurdish leaders were assassinated during the negotiation in Vienna in 1989 by the so-called Iranian diplomats. The demand of Kurds in Iran is that the federalism and regional autonomy would enable them to control their own affairs, protect their land rights, and exercise their cultural rights. In Iranian Kurdistan, there is flagrant human rights violations, persistent oppression, targeted killings, domination, discrimination, marginalization, and excluded from decision-making. Their culture is suppressed, their religion is discriminated, and there is languicide against Kurdish language in Iran. In many cases, the question of self-determination has been resolved through non-violent means. In example, in Quebec, Wales, and Scotland, separatist movements have not boiled over into violent conflict. In each, the central government granted some self-rule to the separatist region, preventing the situation from turning violent. The movement were able to argue their cases through elected political representatives. It teaches us a real functioning democratic system could reduce the likelihood of violence. In many cases, the non-violence is not enough to have its own right. In Iran, all peaceful options have been blocked by central government. The only option for the Kurds and other ethnic groups existing is to accept the subordination and assimilation policies of the Persian-based central government. But increased oppression and continued social and economic marginalization of the Kurds and other people in Iran will generate more extremist backlash and will bring Iran towards much more instability. Several international conventions reaffirm the right to self-determination, but they also pledge to uphold the principle of territorial integrity and the rights of existing states to prevent regions from seceding. Unfortunately, self-determination only exists on papers. The UN member states block any attempt to secede, even if there are serious violations of human rights. The question is that what option remains when nation states in countries like Iran block any peaceful solution for the Kurds and other ethnic groups, and on the other part, internationally, the UN member states block any attempt to secede. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr.Baban Eliassi. That was our last speaker who evoked the Kurdish plight on this fight for self-determination. Thank you very much for your to all the speakers who have beautifully come with their people's problem, and This was a very rich experience today to have all of you speaking about the struggle for self-determination, and it is very shocking, but at the same time not really, because we are coming across the same. We can point many similarities, be it Tamils, Kurds, southern Yemenis, southern Cameroons, Western Sahrawis. We can see a lot of similarities in our past, in our historical, in our history, and in our current situation, and how we face these problems within the framework of the United Nations. And the major thing here was every speaker evoked this problem of the UN's role, and with the major question, which is self-determination still possible within the framework of United Nations, and how far United Nations is attentive to our problems. So with these questions, we can welcome now our guest today, Dr. Fernand de Varennes, who is our Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. So without further delay, I welcome Dr. Fernand de Varennes to give his speech on this issue of self-determination. The floor is yours, sir.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Misha. Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome, or hello everyone, or good morning here in my part of Canada. Good afternoon to many of you in Europe, and good evening for some of you in other parts of the world. First of all, I want to express my gratitude and the honor also at the invitation from the Tamil Rights Activist Forum for the opportunity of participating in this forum on the right of self-determination of nations and minorities. I think one of the points I'd like to mention before I actually begin is how much I appreciate hearing some very powerful messages and the information and the understanding that you've shared with all of us today on the situations of minorities and other groups in different parts of the world. And what struck me is how much there is much that has to be done if really we are to protect the human rights of everyone and live in societies that are just and fair for all of those that live in these countries. The other issue that struck me is the extent. It should be clear, I think, to most of us that there are serious challenges in relation to how the United Nations deals with issues of conflict, of tensions, and we should say, and we should recognize injustice and even brutality against certain segments of the population in various parts of the world. And I think it's important to be honest and to recognize that through much of its history, the United Nations is mainly what we call an IGO. Essentially, it was created as an intergovernmental organization. And therefore, many of its structures, much of its functioning and its approach deals with actually reflecting the interests and the concerns of governments, of countries, of states. Now, having said that, and connecting to the issue that you have raised, which is an extremely important one, the issue of self-determination, the United Nations has developed into an organization which is very clearly concerned with human rights issues, with the protection of human rights. Does it really, does it succeed all the time? Well, we all know that it doesn't. We all know that there are serious, extremely serious situations of violations of human rights around the world, including particularly in relation to some of the most vulnerable communities, such as minorities and women in many parts of the world. However, one point which I think is the issue which you've raised very often is that the situation has evolved. If you look at the role of the United Nations in issues of self-determination, the issue of self-determination only really began to crystallize at the United Nations in the 1950s and 60s. In other words, it's a situation which emerged after its creation and started to develop and strengthen over the decades. in relation to what is self-determination and who is able to claim self-determination. Now, I don't want to give a lecture today, but I think many of you understand that at the beginning, the concept of self-determination at the United Nations was very restricted. They were really talking about nations, but nations or peoples, which meant states initially. Then it evolved to include non-self-governing territories, former colonies, like we have heard today in relation to Western Sahara. And then further on, and here is, I think, the positive note that we should think about, further on, it started to talk about the self-determination of indigenous peoples. This is a much more recent phenomenon, but it is one which is acknowledged at the United Nations today as self-determination in a more limited sense of internal self-determination within the state, but that indigenous peoples have a right of self-determination, which means they have the right to some form of self-rule, of autonomy, of control over their own affairs that they can exercise. And I want to emphasize that for two reasons. One, that it shows that there is an evolution which continues today, hasn't stopped, which it is my hope, and I'll refer to this later on, that can be extended to other groups, that the right of self-determination should be the right also of minorities. It's not quite there yet, but if we look at what has been occurring with the right of indigenous peoples, this is a direction which I think clearly we can talk about. And in fact, not only should we talk about, but we should be working towards as an objective in order to improve, very honestly, the functioning of the United Nations in relation to, well, what is self-determination, who is entitled to that, but also to better protect minorities around the world. Now, once again, I think we need to be frank, perhaps even blunt. There are situations such as the case of the Western Sahara, as we've heard earlier, which clearly should be, I will use a colloquial expression, a no-brainer. Clearly, here is a situation of a group that in international law has the right to self-determination. It's still not being implemented properly, but still we need to actually sustain attention, raise awareness, and actually work towards what should be clearly a fundamental right of the Sahari people in Western Sahara. Secondly, in the case of self-determination for other groups, indigenous peoples, and I would say minorities, I want to emphasize to you that things are beginning to change a little bit. And I would like to invite you to also consider this and work together, work with my mandate and other institutions to actually perhaps push things in this direction. Last year, there was a new report prepared by an institute connected with the government of Liechtenstein. And it is a report on self-determination. So it just came out last year. But the report actually, I think, very clearly indicates that the right of self-determination should be expanded, should be opened up so that it clearly includes, well, indigenous peoples, but also minorities and other groups which currently within the United Nations that the system really doesn't acknowledge that they have a right of autonomy, for example, of self-rule, of controlling their own affairs. I mentioned that report, obviously it is a report of a center connected with the government of Liechtenstein, but there are other governments around the world and other institutions that are interested in this concept of self-determination as a form or an approach that would help to better protect the rights of minorities and other vulnerable groups and communities. Secondly, also help prevent violent conflicts. I don't think anyone here is naive enough to believe that conflicts simply happen. There are contexts, usually of exclusion, of discrimination, of violence against certain communities, and especially minorities, which lead to violent conflicts. And that by giving a degree of self-determination, in the sense of real autonomy, real power to protect the populations such as indigenous peoples, minorities, and others, that this is one of the most effective tools to prevent conflicts around the world. The preceding speaker, I think from the Kurdish minority in Iran, did mention there are plenty of examples around the world where giving autonomy to the French-speaking people in Quebec, to the German-speaking people in Italy, and many other examples were ways to prevent, to stop conflicts from becoming extremely violent by ensuring that the populations involved, the minorities or other groups, feel that they have control over their own lives, have a real place and voice and power within the context of the state. Here's my invitation and the point I would like to raise, that where perhaps you can do more to help us change the United Nations and perhaps change also the practices in many countries. This year is the 30th anniversary. It's been 3 decades since the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Minorities. The declaration is a political statement. It's not a legal document, but it actually does provide some degree of protection for minorities. However, we're using this 30th anniversary this year to organize within the context of 4 regional forums in 4 parts of the world, regional meetings, regional forums, to look at what can we do to actually improve the protection of minorities. That's my mandate, minorities around the world. What could be better measures, better activities of the United Nations to try to make this real, to try to make this more effective and concrete? And one of the suggestions I would hope, or invitations I would make to you, is please participate in these regional forums, these regional discussions, where you will, if you email to my mandate, we can provide you greater detail. But I think it's important to use this, perhaps as a way to help improve the United Nations in what it is doing to protect minorities, improve the international mechanisms to actually perhaps open the discussion on the right of self-determination, expanding it and making it stronger. There will be, after these regional forums, the United Nations Forum on Minorities in Geneva in December of this year, which would focus on the same thing. Yes, let's celebrate the anniversary of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Minorities, but secondly, let's do better. Let's move forward, and we need to hear the voices of minorities to make sure that their human rights, including the right of self-determination, is eventually recognized, incorporated, and attempts made to improve what actually doesn't always work very effectively. Let me just give you a couple of examples, and I think we should open the floor for further discussions. I'll be let me be honest, in the sense that I also, even as a UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues, face obstacles from the United Nations. I've been told not to get involved with Yemen, by the way, because, well, I had received allegations involving the Shia minority in part of the country. And the message I was told was that this population was not a minority. I won't go into the detail of the arguments, but essentially, if there are no minorities, I cannot get involved. This happened with Yemen. This happened with Ethiopia, also with another group. And it happens actually rather surprisingly often when United Nations officials do not want us, or in this, I should say, me, to get involved because they're not comfortable with the idea that there are minorities that have rights that they can claim in complex situations. We need to work together to do more, to do better, and to improve what sometimes institutionally, even at the United Nations, is not always easy when we refer to the rights of minorities. So on that note, I will stop here. Once again, express my gratitude to be able not only to share with you a few of my own observations in relation to self-determination, but also to be able to actually hear from you and better understand what is the context in many of your countries, which needs to be addressed. Obviously, I agree with that. Merci beaucoup. Et je retourne la parole à Madame Nisha pour la continuation de ce forum. Merci.